Welcome to this last episode of Bill and Kipp's Excellent Adventure as we have been going through the Gospel of John. This week we'll be looking at the last chapter, chapter 21, and we welcome you. My name is Kipp McClurg, and this is Bill Brunson, and we're two of the pastors at Vestavia Hills United Methodist Church, and we're excited to look and see where John finally lands this and some of the sort of special meanings of this very last chapter. Now, we in the last of the series, we were looking at the resurrection, and it felt like John had sort of put a bow on it and wrapped it up and said, hey, this is great, and we're done. And then all of a sudden we have this chapter that sort of is added on at the end. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of it involves Simon Peter and the disciples. It seems that they are off doing what they did before. They're on the Sea of Galilee. They're trying to fish. Apparently their skills have slackened a bit and not doing a great job at catching fish. And then Jesus shows up and says, hey, why don't you drop your nets on the other side of the boat? And they drop them in, and suddenly they get this huge catch of fish, and then they recognize that it's Jesus.
Yeah, this is just a unique chapter in so many ways. There doesn't appear it doesn't appear that there really were any additions of the Gospel of John without this chapter. It appears in all the earliest writing, all the earliest compilations of the book of the Bible. But it definitely is an add-on chapter in that he does end the book before this pops in. And so there's rationales behind that. We'll get into that in just a little while. But it's really there's a couple of neat things. One being that in most translations, John refers to this as the Sea of Tiberias, which is significant because in the time of Jesus, Tiberias was a brand new city. And so it was being built by Herod, the son of Herod the Great. It was being built, and the Jewish people didn't particularly like it in the time of Jesus because of where Herod was building Tiberias. It was a great source of water, but there was a cemetery there that he sort of built on top of, and the Jewish people don't appreciate that. And there was other issues. But by the time John's writing his gospel, Tiberias is a center of Jewish learning because Jerusalem is gone, and so they're going other places, and so Tiberias is dominant. And so while the Sea of Galilee is located in the Galilee, Tiberias is the main city on the Sea of Galilee at that time, and so it is now referred in John's writing the Sea of Tiberias.
So it would feel that historically, as John is by then a much older man, mm-hmm. that the language would lend itself to being sort of at the right time frame for someone of his age,
right? To
tack a little postscript onto the book,
right? And then I love that they show that Jesus is on the shore, and he calls out, like you mentioned, "Children, have you caught any fish?" And they go, "No." And his answer is, "Cast your net on the right side." Cast your net on the right side of the boat. Well, they probably all stood there for a minute and went, I don't even know how to do that. Because they fished on the left side of the boat. Because when they cast their nets, they were able to use their right arm, and everything was they would angle themselves. Everything was set up in the boat so they could cast their nets on that side of the boat and
it's
bring
like your
things
golf
in.
clubs. You just can't turn
You
and
can't
switch.
Yeah. And so suddenly he's telling them, throw it to the other side. Well, but they do. They're willing to turn, and they're willing to cast their net on the other side. And they start hauling in fish. And I love the fact that when the people start hauling in the fish, it's John that recognizes that it's Jesus. Peter, it's the Lord, he says. And there's a weird moment here that does disturb me about the fishing practices of the disciples. because it says that Peter stood up and put on his outer garment. And in some translations, it says because he was naked. And I'm thinking, I don't fish like that.
That's not my style of fishing.
Nobody fish. Who fishes like that? I mean, that's just odd. And I like the fact that he puts on his outer garment and then jumps in the water
then he
and
goes swimming.
Swims to shore.
Fully clothed.
And abandons the 10 disciples out in the boat.
With this huge load of fish pulling the boat in. You know.
And then he waits on the shore, standing there dripping wet with Jesus, as the disciples come to shore, and they pull in 153 fish.
Very
specific. 153 fish. Now, oh wise one, tell us the exact reason why it's 153 fish.
Well, I don't know ultimately that there's an exact answer, but some have proposed that was the number of people groups, known cultures at the time of that writing, so that the fish that Jesus would catch would be all of the different kinds of fish, all of the children of the world, as we would say. And so that's one theory as to why the 153.
Another reason that I've heard in one of my trips to Israel was that in Jewish numerology, which numerology is very significant for the Jewish people, surely you've picked up on biblical things like number 3, 7, 12, 40. These seem to be big numbers.
They keep coming back.
Well, 153 in Jewish numerology, if you take the words Ani Elohim, I am God, Yahweh, if we translate it that way, 153 is the addition of those of the words I am God. And so it is, again, Jesus in sort of a fancy way, reminding the disciples who he is. Yeah. You know, you'll catch 153 fish, proving I am God.
Right. And then the Ithcus becomes the symbol of that.
That's right.
And so anyway, so a lot of different theories. We're not absolutely sure, but it is definitely a curious number. Mm-hmm. Now, we go back. I brought out the bag of charcoal. Now, of course, we have succeeded in not spending any money whatsoever on our special effects budget, and so that is a great goal that we've been able to achieve. I borrowed this from our kitchen here at the church. I will return it, but it's some kings for charcoal, and we talked a little of this in a previous episode, but the word charcoal only comes up twice in the New Testament, and it's both of it's in John. And here we are. Jesus is standing on the shore, and he's not just there waving. It says that he was cooking fish on a kind of a grill.
Yeah.
And
on a charcoal fire.
And Peter comes up to him. The other disciples are, they're disposed over here with the 153 fish. Peter's over here with Jesus on this charcoal fire. And we're reminded the only other place is now slaves and the officer were standing there having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. And so there's this connection between these two chapters, between Jesus and Peter, the only two present in that courtyard, in that place, that area, and the fire from a charcoal and the smell that would be there.
And Peter's standing by, dripping wet, warming himself
by this fire.
How many different ways can Peter be drawn backwards in time?
And it's in that place, and that he denied Jesus 3 times. And it's in this chapter that Jesus then asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" 3 times denied, 3 times asked. And it's curious because the Greek words are very different, and it's trying to figure out exactly what's going on, or if you're over reading into it, it's kind of hard to know. But the first 2 times Jesus says, "Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me with a divine kind of love.
Unconditional,
Yeah.
divine kind of love, yeah.
And he responds, I philo you, which is kind of the Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It's, I love you like a brother.
Right.
And, you know, I think the original reader would have scratched your head going, well, that's not exactly what Jesus asked.
Yeah.
You know,
Those aren't the same thing.
yeah. So Jesus repeats it. Peter, second denial, do you love me with God's kind of divine love, with unconditional love? And he says, I love you like a brother. And then, but each time, on each of those, Jesus says, then go and feed my sheep, my lambs. And then the third one, Jesus, interestingly, changes his. And it makes you wonder if he realizes Peter's still got a little way to go before he fully steps into the role of what he's supposed to be. And many people believe that part of the reason that this chapter is added is that John is trying to help reinforce the primacy of Peter as a leader of the church. But it's almost like Jesus realizes Peter's still not quite there. So Jesus says, Peter, do you philo me? Do you love me like a brother? And Peter says, yes, I love you like a brother. And then Jesus says, then, and he changes the words, shepherd my flock. And so, of course, from the earliest days, then Peter becomes sort of the recognized of all the shepherds. He is sort of the chief of the shepherds of the early church.
Right. Yeah. The place where this happens on the Sea of Galilee, or Sea of Tiberias, is called the primacy of Peter, or it's called Christa Mesa, the Lord's table, because Jesus is cooking the meal on the fire. And it is that idea that John includes this and feels the necessity to include this, because where his gospel ends, the last major moment with Peter as a disciple was, we had two really. One was him denying Jesus, standing by a fire outside the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And the second was him running out to the tomb, being outran by John, and going into a tomb and coming back out and going back to lock himself in a room. And some people believe that John includes this because John, when he's writing this, is believed he lives in Ephesus. And the Ephesian church was, of course, a church that was very much connected to the Apostle Paul. And remember, Paul writes the letter to the church in Ephesus, Ephesians, and they're very much devoted to Paul. And so some believe that John writes this chapter so that all the people who have come into the faith through Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentiles, all the Gentiles who have come into the faith, so that they will understand that Peter was the head of the disciples. That it wasn't Paul, that yes, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but Peter and Jesus made up. Jesus calls Peter back, and even after he says, shepherd my flock, he calls Peter and says, follow me. I mean, it's that renewal of Peter as the leader. And of course, by the time John is writing, some think that he wrote his gospel in the 80s, around 80 AD, somewhere in there. Paul and Peter have been gone since 67 AD. Paul beheaded in Rome, and Peter crucified upside down in Rome by his own choosing, because he doesn't want to die the same death. He doesn't feel worthy to die the same death as Jesus on a cross upright, and so he asked that his cross be inverted, and so his cross is upside down. I cannot begin to imagine the horrors of dying on something like that. But yes, this is it's the renewal of Peter in this very powerful way, where he is brought back. And there's a statue that is here that is Peter finally kneeling and falling at the feet of Jesus. You can see the Sea of Galilee in the background, and Peter being just so emotional as Jesus reaches out and calls him again to follow me. And it's a powerful, powerful moment, the renewal of Peter. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church holds that because of Peter's ministry in Rome, that he's considered to be the first bishop of Rome, which then ultimately would make him, in the line of popes, considered to be the first pope. And Peter is the only name which a subsequent pope cannot take. We have had many Pope Pauls, John Paul, etc., but the Catholic Church they cannot retake the name of Peter.
And if the Vatican was built where it is, because that's believed to be where Peter was buried.
Right.
And historically, in World War II, they actually tunneled down and found graves underneath there, and pretty sure they found what they really truly believe is the grave of Peter. Mm-hmm. And so it's an interesting piece where John feels, it seems, that he really wants to make sure the early church understands that Peter was very much so considered the leader of the earliest of the church.
Right.
But he also, had a lot of influence in the other churches in the region where Paul had been, in Ephesus, and some of the others that received the revelation that was related to John. And so it's interesting how he's he's putting a different bow, mm-hmm. Trying to help to pull those two together.
Because I imagine for John, Peter may have been a part of John's life all along. I mean, from birth on, being in Capernaum, and it could have been, I mean, I think the relationship there was so deep that he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that how the role that Peter played and the connection that Peter had with Jesus. Of course, the book then moves forward a little bit. After Peter is restored, it's almost like John says, okay, since I'm writing a little more, since I'm adding a 21st chapter, well, I'll clear some other stuff up too here at the end. Because in that moment, it shifts, and Peter begins to speak again. And Peter asked Jesus, well, what about this one? And indicating the disciple whom Jesus loved is what it says. And oftentimes people believe that disciple is John himself. And, what will happen to him is sort of Peter's question. And Jesus says, basically, to paraphrase it, Jesus says, if I want him to remain until I return, that's really none of your business. You follow me. And then John clarifies and says, Jesus did not say he would remain. He said, if I want him to remain. And there's a lot of speculation as to why this was part of the 21st chapter. This was part of this additional chapter. And one belief system is that there had been a few attempts on John's life. John is the last standing disciple. The rest have died. Not died. The rest have been killed. Mm-hmm. The rest have been martyred for their faith in Christ, their unwillingness to recant their faith. They have stayed true to Jesus, and they have all died. And John's the last one standing. And we're told that he is boiled in oil in the gate of the city of Rome, and he doesn't die. Miraculously, he doesn't die. Then he's exiled to Patmos, where he receives the revelation. But while on Patmos, he doesn't die. And so he goes back to Ephesus. In Ephesus, there is an attempt on his life. The church history says there's an attempt where they put hemlock in his wine. But as John blessed the cup of wine before he drank it, the hemlock turns to a snake and crawls out. It's why if you ever see the shields of the apostles, sort of the symbols of the apostles, John is always a chalice with a snake climbing out of it. So church history says that there could have been, by the point he writes his gospel, 3 attempts on his life. Well, when you survive 3 attempts on your life, either then, now, I think whenever, people start asking, can you even kill the guy?
Yeah,
Is it possible to kill him? Is he, is he going to live forever? Can he not die? Well, then people start thinking that he and Jesus had a relationship, a friendship, a bond so close that Jesus said, I'm entrusting my mother to you for you to care for her, that there is a relationship there as disciple and master that's so deep that somewhere along the way, it wasn't recorded, but Jesus told John, you're going to live until I return. But John is saying that's not true. John is, in this part of the gospel, John's saying he didn't say, I would. He never said it. If, not would. And so he's basically, many people believe that John is discounting these rumors by including that part of the story that says, I'm going to die one day. And we know that John does. It's around 95 to 98 AD is when John is recorded to have died. And he is the only disciple that's believed it's possible that he did die of natural causes, because he was a very old man at the time. Although there is a slight possibility that he became a victim of one of the subsequent Roman emperors' abuses of the Christian people. But most people believe that John died of natural causes. And then John wraps the book up again. I mean, he's gone through all this, and now it's time to wrap it up again. And he says, I've told you all of this so that you'll believe. I've written everything down I could. But if I tried to write down everything that Jesus said, everything that Jesus did, well, the world couldn't contain all of the scrolls that I would have to write. And so I've given you this. I mean, it's a nice ending, but and just think, if John would have written all that down, think about how many more episodes of Bill and Kipp's Excellent Bible Adventure we would be able to do.
It would be insurmountable. But I am grateful that John did write these things, because it has been a huge influence on my life, and it's been a whole lot of fun to look back at what he said.
And as we started off saying, the Gospel of John is our favorite of the Gospel stories, because the way John tells the story, it's not just trying to record the event, but through the way John writes the Gospel, you feel like you get to know Jesus at a deeper level, an emotional level. You feel like you get to know the disciples and even Caiaphas and the Pharisees and Pilate. You feel like you get to know these people in a way that it just enriches your faith.
And he has such unique characters with the man born blind and Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman and Lazarus, who don't really show up in the other Gospels, but who have these layers of faith that we can learn from and that can be models for our lives.
And so we hope that you enjoyed this, and we hope that you will sit down at this point and simply go back, start in the beginning was the Word in chapter 1, and read your way through to chapter 21 one more time, just to feel the depth and the breadth of John's gospel, and to experience our Lord through the eyes of one who loved him so much.
But we thank you for joining us on this very long, but hopefully profitable journey.